The courtroom buzzed with quiet laughter, but none of it came from the defendant's table. Jalen Dawson stood alone, 19 years old, wearing a second-hand suit that didn't quite fit. His hands were calm, his jaw steady, but his eyes, sharp, unblinking, didn't match his age. Across the room, Judge Walter Grayson leaned back in his leather chair, lips curled in amusement. "So," the judge said, voice laced with mockery, "the genius would like to represent himself?" A wave of smirks and muffled chuckles swept through the courtroom. Even the prosecutor grinned, flipping casually through his file. The bailiff didn't hide his grin. The gallery murmured like an audience watching a doomed performance. Jalen didn't blink. He simply nodded. "Yes, Your Honor." The judge leaned forward, studying him like a child holding a toy gavel. "You do realize this isn't a school project, right?" Jalen's voice came quiet but resolute. "I'm aware." Grayson sighed theatrically. "This'll be short." He banged the gavel once. The trial began. No one in that room, not the judge, not the prosecutor, not the jury, knew that Jalen had waited his entire life for this moment. That while they saw a poor black kid who stole a car, he saw a broken system, and he was about to put it on trial. Jalen Dawson wasn't supposed to be here, at least not as a defendant. He grew up in the shadows of the Los Angeles County Courthouse, just 10 blocks away in a 2-bedroom apartment with peeling paint, leaky faucets, and shelves full of law books his mother brought home from her job as a paralegal. While other kids shot hoops or played Xbox, Jalen memorized Miranda rights and dissected cross-examinations like puzzles. He didn't play pretend. He practiced closing arguments in the mirror, building cases in his head the way some kids built Lego castles. By the time he was 14, he could recite full court transcripts from memory. Not because someone made him, because he needed to. The law wasn't just fascinating, it was survival. He saw what happened to people who didn't know their rights. Friends, neighbors, even his older cousin Marcus, who took a plea deal just to get out of jail faster, for something he didn't do. Jalen's mother, Denise, worked 2 jobs and still made time to test him on precedent-setting cases over dinner. "You learn the rules," she'd say, "so they don't bury you under them." And he did. He carried those rules like armor, quiet, invisible, always ready. But none of that mattered the night he got arrested. Wrong place, wrong time, a mistaken identity, or maybe just an easy target. He knew how the system worked, how it looked for shortcuts. His skin, his clothes, his zip code, all of it painted a story that didn't match who he really was. Now, facing felony charges, Jalen stood inside the very place he once dreamed of practicing in. But not as an attorney, as the accused. Still, even now, even here, he didn't tremble. He had studied this system. He knew how it moved, how it bent, how it broke. And today, he wasn't just fighting for himself. He was about to show everyone that just because you're underestimated doesn't mean you're unprepared. They saw a kid without a lawyer, but he'd been preparing for this trial his entire life. Judge Walter Grayson had seen hundreds of defendants, most of them young, black, and barely represented. To him, this case was no different. Grand theft auto, resisting arrest, open and shut. He didn't need nuance. Just the paperwork and enough patience to pretend he cared. And when Jalen announced he'd be representing himself, Grayson didn't just see arrogance, he saw comedy. "A legal prodigy, huh?" he'd muttered to the clerk that morning. "Let's see how long that lasts." The prosecution, led by Assistant District Attorney Mitchell Carrington, shared that sentiment. Carrington was a polished man built for courtroom theatrics. His tailored suit, perfect hair, and Harvard law degree gave him an air of entitlement. To him, Jalen wasn't a real opponent. He was an intermission. Carrington opened the trial with a smirk, presenting a narrative already designed to convict. Jalen was caught driving a stolen Audi A6. Fingerprints on the wheel. Officer Ruiz's written statement claiming he saw Jalen behind the wheel during a brief chase through downtown LA. It was airtight on the surface. But Carrington didn't expect questions. He didn't expect Jalen to stand tall, voice even, eyes sharp. He didn't expect resistance. Meanwhile, Judge Grayson rolled his eyes at every objection Jalen raised. Sustained or not, it didn't matter. His mind was already made up. To him, this was a formality before a sentencing. The public defender assigned to Jalen had barely prepared, just another underpaid cog in a system that kept moving, guilty or not. And, at the heart of it all, a power imbalance so stark it didn't even need to be spoken. Jalen was a 19-year-old black kid with no legal degree, standing against a seasoned white prosecutor, an unsympathetic judge, and a room trained to disbelieve him. His voice, no matter how steady, was still the defendant. His logic, no matter how sound, was still audacity. The gallery wasn't expecting a fight. They were expecting a fall. And yet Jalen didn't flinch. Because he wasn't just battling a legal case. He was battling the weight of assumption, the quiet agreement in the room that people like him never win. Not in this courtroom. Not in this system. But they didn't know what he knew. They didn't know he had read every page of his discovery file 3 times over. That he had memorized courtroom procedure. That he knew what they overlooked, and more importantly, what they never expected him to find. And the moment was coming. The moment where the whole room would realize. He wasn't just here to defend himself. He was here to dismantle everything they thought they knew. The air in the courtroom had shifted. What began as amusement now simmered with something else, uncertainty. Not from Jalen, from everyone else. Mitchell Carrington strode confidently to the center of the courtroom, notes in hand, shoulders squared. He was used to this rhythm. Control the narrative, dominate the room, score an easy win. But as he presented his opening argument, his gaze kept flickering back to Jalen, who sat calmly, hands folded on the table, watching. Not blinking. Not flinching. The prosecution laid out the timeline. A stolen 2022 Audi A6. A brief downtown chase. A positive ID by Officer Ruiz. Fingerprints on the steering wheel. Simple, clean, lethal. The gallery nodded along. The jurors shifted forward. Judge Grayson leaned back, arms crossed, already satisfied. Then came the defense. Jalen stood slowly, buttoning his wrinkled blazer with deliberate calm. His footsteps were quiet on the tile. He didn't fumble with papers or speak too fast. He just looked, first at the judge, then the jury, then Carrington. And then he spoke. "Your Honor," he began, "before we get into evidence, I'd like to clarify a point raised by the prosecution." Carrington's smirk twitched. "Of course you would." Jalen ignored him. "The prosecution claims that Officer Ruiz personally witnessed me behind the wheel of the vehicle before I was apprehended." He turned toward the judge. "May I request that we verify the officer's GPS logs from the night in question?" A pause. Small. Sharp. Carrington stiffened. "Your Honor, the officer's testimony is already submitted in the report. This is a stalling tactic." But Grayson squinted now, something gnawing at the edges of his confidence. "It's a fair question. If the officer saw him, the GPS data should match." Carrington hesitated. That hesitation cracked the room. The jury noticed. The gallery noticed. Even the bailiff, silent until now, tilted his head slightly. Jalen didn't smile. He didn't need to. Instead, he walked back to his table and pulled out a copy of the police report. His fingers moved slowly, deliberately, as he held it up. In the officer's own words, Jalen said, "He identified me during the chase." But according to the time-stamped dash cam footage, entered into evidence by the prosecution, Officer Ruiz's vehicle wasn't even within 5 blocks of the stolen car until after it was abandoned. A silence fell like a dropped gavel. Judge Grayson shifted in his seat. His fingers, which had been drumming idly on the bench, froze. Carrington cleared his throat, suddenly flipping pages in his folder. The confidence in his voice was cracking. The report, the department, must have misfiled. Jalen cut in gently, or the report was altered. The words hung in the air, not shouted, not angry, quiet, accusatory in stillness. The jurors leaned forward, some exchanging glances. A woman in the gallery clasped her purse tighter. The court reporter stopped typing, just for a second. Even Judge Grayson seemed to lose focus for a beat, staring at the young man standing before him like he was seeing him for the first time. Jalen returned to the center of the courtroom. He placed the file down, hands still and open. No badge, no title, no degree. But I read every word. I verified every timeline. I cross-referenced every file. I don't need credentials to see that something doesn't add up. Carrington tried to regain control. This is all circumstantial. The fingerprint evidence places him inside the car. Jalen turned, meeting his gaze. Does touching something make you guilty of taking it? He asked softly. If I lean on a car door and walk away, and someone steals an hour later, am I the thief? The room was holding its breath. One of the jurors shifted in their seat. Another scratched a note into the pad on their lap. Jalen continued, voice never rising. The truth isn't in the noise. It's in the pauses, in the gaps no one thought I'd find. And if the people entrusted to tell the truth bend it instead. He turned toward the judge. Then what exactly are we doing here? For the first time, Judge Grayson didn't have a response. The courtroom wasn't laughing anymore. It was listening. The courtroom was locked in stunned silence, as if someone had pulled the volume from the walls. For the first time since the trial began, Carrington looked unsettled, his fingers twitching against the table, the corner of his jaw tightening like he was biting down on frustration. His case was beginning to unravel, and he knew it. But Jalen wasn't done. He stepped forward again, the same quiet confidence in his stride, the same measured tone, calm, deliberate, unshaken. Your Honor, he said, turning to Judge Grayson, I'd like to introduce an overlooked piece of evidence, the original witness statement from the owner of the vehicle, Mr. Raymond Whitaker. Carrington's head shot up. Grayson leaned forward, eyes narrowing. The prosecution didn't submit a statement from the owner. Jalen nodded. They did. It's buried in the preliminary report. Page 13, paragraph 3. He lifted the file, flipping it open with a familiarity that startled the clerk watching from aside. Mr. Whitaker told officers, I left the car running outside the gas station. Someone jumped in and drove off. I only caught a glimpse, but I know the kid was white. A visible ripple passed through the room. A gasp from the gallery. A juror leaned back in her seat, visibly stunned. Carrington scrambled for his copy, flipping pages with shaking fingers. His voice cracked slightly as he spoke. That line was, the lighting was poor. It wasn't definitive. But it was excluded, Jalen replied, cutting through the air. A description that didn't match me, not even close. And yet the police found a black teenager walking nearby and decided that was enough. He turned to the jury now, making eye contact with each one of them. What if I hadn't asked for that file? What if I hadn't read every word of that report myself? Would anyone have noticed that the only witness said the suspect didn't look like me? Carrington's mouth opened, but no defense came. Jalen stepped back and let the weight of that settle. Grayson shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Why wasn't this brought up earlier, Mr. Carrington? Carrington hesitated. Too long. I assumed it wasn't relevant. No, Jalen said quietly. You assumed no one would read it. The judge blinked, and for a moment, the room felt as if it had stopped spinning. All the assumptions, the biases, the silent confidence of a courtroom that had believed this case would be a formality, were gone. Jalen turned again, walking to the witness stand where a single man waited, Officer Daniel Ruiz. He looked uncomfortable, shifting under the lights. Jalen raised a paper. This is Officer Ruiz's written testimony. He claims he saw me in the stolen car during the chase, but the dash cam says otherwise. His vehicle didn't arrive on scene until after the car was abandoned. Judge Grayson leaned in. Is that true, officer? Ruiz swallowed hard, then nodded. I arrived late. Another officer relayed what he saw over radio. But you wrote the report as if you saw it yourself. Ruiz looked away. That's how we sometimes phrase things in pursuit situations. Grayson's voice dropped. That's called misrepresentation, officer. Ruiz didn't respond. The courtroom had gone from laughter to discomfort, from mockery to reckoning. Jalen took a deep breath. His voice didn't tremble. Your Honor, I'd also like to note that the prosecution's fingerprint evidence is incomplete. The forensic analyst who handled the prints was never called to testify. I've reviewed the chain of custody. It was broken. The prints were processed by a third-party lab under contract with the LAPD, not directly by the department. Grayson blinked. Are you saying the evidence was potentially contaminated? I'm saying, Jalen said firmly, we don't know. Because they never expected anyone to ask. Carrington sat, silent. He knew it was over. This wasn't just a defendant trying to avoid conviction. This was someone who had studied every crack in the system and held a light to each one. And the system blinked first. Grayson leaned back in his chair. His posture had changed. No more crossed arms. No more smug grin. Instead, the faint creases of thought lined his forehead, like someone finally realizing they'd misjudged a book by its spine. Jalen returned to his seat, folding his hands calmly. He didn't gloat. He didn't smirk. Because he hadn't done this for applause. He had done this to be heard. And now finally he was. The prosecution had no rebuttal. The gallery was silent. The judge stared for a long moment, then finally spoke, slower this time. This court is going to take a brief recess. I'll return with a decision shortly. As he stood and exited, so did the last remnants of doubt. Because no one in that room saw a defendant anymore. They saw something much more dangerous to the system. A prepared mind. An inconvenient truth. A young black man who knew exactly how the system worked and used its own rules to beat it. When Judge Grayson returned to the bench, the air was noticeably different. The swagger in his step had vanished. The smirk? Gone. He looked older now, wearier, as if the weight of everything said in that courtroom had finally landed on his shoulders. The gallery sat still. The jury held its collective breath. Even Carrington avoided eye contact. His earlier confidence dissolved into quiet shame. Grayson adjusted his glasses, then looked directly at Jalen. This court, he began, his voice stripped of arrogance, has reviewed the evidence and the arguments made by the defense. And I must say, he paused, exhaled. This case should never have gone to trial. A few murmurs echoed across the gallery, like the first raindrops of a storm that had been long overdue. Grayson continued, the discrepancies in the report, the inconsistencies in the testimony, and the fact that key information was buried or ignored. All of this points to a systemic failure, not on the part of the defendant, but on the part of the system meant to protect justice. He turned toward Carrington, his tone cooling. The prosecution's negligence in presenting complete evidence is deeply concerning. Carrington nodded stiffly, his jaw clenched. He didn't speak. He couldn't. Grayson looked back to Jalen. Mr. Dawson, this court apologizes. Case dismissed. The gavel came down, not with triumph, but with a long overdue reckoning. Gasps, whispers, then applause. Soft at first. Then louder. Not a celebration, but a release. Jalen didn't move right away. He let the moment land. Carrington slumped into his chair. The bailiff stared at the floor. Officer Ruiz, sitting near the exit, stood and walked out before anyone could say a word. But Judge Grayson, he remained seated, watching Jalen with something new in his eyes. Recognition, maybe even regret. As Jalen gathered his papers, the judge spoke again. Mr. Dawson. Jalen paused. Grayson hesitated, then said, "You ever consider law school?" Jalen allowed himself a faint smile, not out of pride, but clarity. "I already have, Your Honor." He stepped out of the courtroom not as a defendant, but as someone who had changed the room he walked into. The same system that tried to break him had just witnessed its own reflection, and didn't like what it saw. Jalen didn't walk out of that courtroom feeling victorious. He walked out feeling proven, not to the jury, not to the judge, not even to the prosecutor. To himself. He had stood inside a system designed to forget people like him, to label, to silence, to push through another conviction without a second thought. And instead of folding, he had forced it to pause, to see him. And that alone was revolutionary. Outside, the sun hit his face differently. The air felt heavier, more real. Reporters gathered near the courthouse steps, cameras flashing, questions firing. But Jalen didn't stop. He wasn't interested in the spotlight. He had already done what he came to do. His mother was waiting for him at the bottom of the steps, her eyes wet with pride. She didn't say anything right away, just wrapped her arms around him, tightly. The kind of hug that says I knew you could, even when the world didn't. In the days that followed, the story spread. Not because Jalen wanted it to, but because the truth refused to stay quiet. People began asking bigger questions. About how many others had been swallowed by the same silence. About how many more Jalen Dawsons had never been given the chance to speak, to fight, to be heard. And somewhere in that ripple, something shifted. Because Jalen hadn't just defended himself. He exposed a mirror. One that forced the system, and the people inside it, to look. And maybe that's the real lesson. Justice isn't just about courts and gavels and verdicts. It's about courage in the face of certainty. It's about refusing to let someone else tell your story, and daring to write your own instead. Even when the world calls you guilty before you speak. If this story made you pause, even for a moment, then ask yourself, how many voices, like Jalen's, never get the chance to be heard? How many stories get written for people instead of by them? Justice shouldn't depend on luck, preparation, or the ability to outsmart a broken system. It should be fair. It should be human. It should be truthful. But the truth only survives when people are willing to fight for it, and when others are willing to listen. So if this story moved you, share it. Let it spark a conversation, a reflection, a ripple. Because next time, it might not be Jalen. It might be someone you know. Someone who deserves to be seen, heard, and believed before it's too late.